Hey folks, I know you got your AP exam coming up on Wednesday, and I thought I'd give you a quick lit terms review. Um, Quick is a relative thing. I put the list online. You can see it at the bottom of this post. But I've listed all of the, maybe not all, but as many of the lit terms that I think would be useful in a prose prompt essay as I can. And so I'm just going to go over the definitions quickly in the same order that they're written there. It's not even any kind of alphabetical order or anything. I tried to structure them a little bit based on when they showed up in the course or, how they're categorized, but it's just a giant jumble of a list. So let's start and roll down the list. Imagery. You can always analyze the imagery. Why does the author choose to put particular images in there? A lot of times you want to pair that with symbolism. Those images, do they have symbolic value? Are they connected, through an illusion? Like an image of an apple orchard would be connected to Adam and Eve, or, symbolically to innocence, or, like something like that. But there's lots of different images. Images aren't all visual. Just remember, we got 5 senses. There's tactile images and olfactory images and auditory images, and all of those things. So you can look at imagery and why the author chose to use those images. Always put an adjective before imagery if you're writing an essay. Everybody uses imagery. Everybody who ever writes uses imagery. So use an adjective before that to describe the imagery. Speaking of which, tone. Tone is the attitude expressed by the author towards the author's subject, or the speaker, in the case of a character, toward the subject that the character is speaking about. And we can talk about tones. Tone shifts are really huge in stories. So like when somebody's talking about something and they change the way or the feeling of what they're talking, that's something you want to look at. But if you're talking about tone in your essay, always use an adjective before tone. What emotional state is it? You can't just say the author uses tone. That makes no sense. You sound stupid if you do that. So you've got to talk about the kind of tone and think about what tone is going on there. Allegory. If you can find an allegory in what you're reading, that's solid gold. An allegory is when a story has 2 or more levels of meaning. There's a surface level, and then there's a deeper level underneath it. Like when we read Othello, and you could look at the story of Othello as sort of an allegory or retelling of the Garden of Eden story, with Othello sort of as humanity, and Iago as Satan, and Desdemona as sort of an angelic Christ figure. That's an allegory. I mean, you could talk about Animal Farm and communism. There's lots of allegories out there. You can even look at things that are much smaller, like Mary Had Little Lamb being an allegory for Jesus being the lamb, and Mary, the Virgin Mary. So if you can find an allegory in what you're writing about, that's great. Juxtaposition, really useful, especially when you're looking for nuance or complexity, which the AP asks for all the time. When you have 2 things that are compared and contrasted with each other, the literary term for that is juxtaposition. So instead of saying contrast, say juxtaposed. If the author puts 2 things next to each other, or 2 attitudes next to each other, or 2 images next to each other, or 2 characters next to each other, they're juxtaposing those things. We have 2 hands, we have 2 eyes, we have bilateral symmetry. As human beings, we love to juxtapose. It's a very easy thing to do. So if you see that, feel free to use that in your essay. Theme. We want to get down to theme. Remember, this was written by an author. Every author is a teacher. They're trying to get a lesson in there. The easiest thing to talk about in theme, and I said this, in the other document that I've attached there, is social commentary. Every author is a product of their times. They're writing about their own world and their own situation. And so, what things are they calling out? If you can find something that they're calling out, then you've got a theme. Is it like the most recent excerpt from Thomas Hardy that I put out there, social commentary on the class structure. That's a very common theme, especially in Victorian literature. But what is the author trying to criticize? If you find that, you've got a theme. Allusion. Allusions are really, really useful. There's all kinds of allusions. It's a reference to something that theoretically the audience knows and brings depth to the material that's being written about. Their most basic allusions are Christian allusions, allusions to the Bible, and Greek allusions to Greek mythology. Those are pretty common, but you can allude to any work of literature that predates the work, so pay attention to the dates at the top. If something was written in the 1800s, it can't be alluding to Kill a Mockingbird because that was written in 1960. So you got to pay attention to those dates. But anytime you reference another work of literature that came before your work of literature, you call that an allusion, and that's important. So what's the author doing through allusions? The more well-read you are, the more you can get allusions. But you can also allude to historical events or historical figures or things like that. Ideal. This goes back to Beowulf. Beowulf represented an ideal. An ideal is a perfect example of something that's really unattainable to human beings. But the attempt to try and live up to that ideal makes you better. Sort of like Sir Gawain following the code of chivalry, or Beowulf representing an ideal to the Anglo-Saxon people. Sometimes you run into that, and sometimes that's where a level of nuance or complexity comes into a passage where somebody's being compared to an ideal and they can't live up, and thereby the relationship gets worse or something like that. So you see this mostly in passages where there's a complex relationship between a child and a parent. Either the child has an ideal image of what a parent should be and the parent isn't living up to it, or the parent has an ideal image of what they want their child to be and the child isn't living up to it. You can see it in relationship pieces as well. But that's useful to you, I think, as a writer of prose prompts. Characterization. A lot of them ask you to talk about characters. Kind of like that one on the rainbow that I put out there, like the woman's character and her complex situation. So if you're looking at characters, a lot of what you're looking at is what we call direct versus indirect characterization. So if you recall, direct characterization is when the author tells you something just straight up about a character. This person's a bad person, this person's a good person, this person does this, or like when you don't have to think about it as a reader. You don't have to internalize or do any analysis. Not particularly useful, not particularly complex. But indirect characterization, what an author implies about a character through that character's own words or actions, that's really useful. So what can we imply? You can use that term, indirect characterization, as a literary term. It makes your analysis literary. Rather than treating the character as a real person, though, you're treating the character as a construction, and you're thinking about what the author's trying to imply about the character through the way that the author constructed the character on paper. So look at direct and indirect characterization, both useful to you. The different character types may be useful, maybe not. A flat character, a round character, a dynamic character, a static character. Remember, the most useful of those would be a dynamic character. If you see a character who goes through a character shift, that's going to be thematic. There's something important going on behind the scenes there. What makes a character round? What makes a character three-dimensional? What makes you... So you could talk about how an author is rounding a character through their description or through the information that the author is providing, and that would make it sort of literary as well. Another character relationship that I think is worth noting is we talked about foils. When you have that minor character who, through comparison or contrast, reveals the traits, strengths, or weaknesses of a major character, you may have a passage that deals with sort of a foil relationship. And so you can look at that and talk about it. Remember, we had Unferth and Beowulf as our first foil relationship, but we also had the Lady and Gawain was another one. Emilia and Desdemona, I would say, would be another foil relationship. They've been all throughout our literature. A number of your outside reading books have them as well. You could look at Oedipus and Tiresias in a foil relationship. So if you get any kind of a passage like that, you can write about that and get some good mileage in your essay. Symbols. Symbols are huge. If you can identify a symbol, some object or something that symbolizes or represents something more than itself. If you see that in your passage, that's a gold mine. What is being symbolically represented as what? And it doesn't always have to be an object. It could be an action. It could be, like the way somebody is physically standing symbolizes their internal attitude about another character. So there's that, or the way somebody is described symbolizes something about their personality or their ideas. So keep your eye on symbols when something represents something else. Then we have a whole category called figurative language. Figurative, remember, is the opposite of literal. It's anything that's not literally happening. And there's a list, and I don't want to go over all of them because you know them already. But a paradox is an impossible or illogical statement that is true. Oscar Wilde loves paradox. We got it all over the place in The Importance of Being Earnest. Oxymoron is just two words that are, boom, right next to each other like cold fire. They have opposite meanings. It's used for dramatic effect. Then you got personification. Why is something being given human characteristics? Why is the moon sad? What does that say about the situation? What does that say about the passage? Why is, the ground like a series of little shark's teeth? What is the author trying to get at? And a lot of times personification is connected to symbolism and getting some sort of overarching theme or tone, or like there's a lot of sort of overlap in terms, and you can use them in a strong way if you can overlap the terms. So personification, human traits to inanimate objects or animals or whatever. Consonant. Why did I put consonants on the list? Ignore that I put consonants on the list. That's a poetics term that's not going to help you a lot. Metaphor and simile, you know those. Metaphor is your fail-safe. If you know something's figurative language and you don't know what it is, just say it's metaphorical. Nobody can say that's wrong. It's not literally happening, it's metaphorically happening. But if you see or like or as, it means it's a simile. Hyperbole is the fancy word for exaggeration, so rather than use exaggeration, use hyperbole. But remember, the author uses hyperbole for a purpose. We're using some sort of an overstatement on purpose to impact the reader. How is the hyperbole thematic? How is it impacting the reader? How is it setting the tension or the mood or whatever? Then, when we're looking at characters, tragic flaw comes from tragedy, and usually we only apply it to tragic figures, but a lot of times characters in stories have tragic flaws. And a lot of times the powerful excerpts that you pick, or the AP picks to give you, will show you a character and highlight that character's flaw. So I left tragic flaw on the list. Like a couple of timed writings ago on the class webpage, I did one where... it was from George Eliot's Middlemarch, and there was a woman whose tragic flaw was sort of her own want of luxury, and her husband whose tragic flaw was his pride in being self-sufficient, and the two of these things clashed and created the complicated nature of their relationship. And you could look at that and you could say, hey, these things are tragic flaws that are dooming their relationship. It would be a way to make your argument literary again. So I left that on the list. The basic tragic flaw in Greek stories is hubris, excessive pride. It's a nice term to throw in there, shows that you're intellectual. So if you see somebody who's got pride, you could throw the term hubris out there. Nothing wrong with that. Comic relief, again, if you get a passage that has a funny moment in it, you could talk about comic relief. It's used to ease the tension. So that's something that you could notice. By the way, irony is huge. If you've got a passage that asks you in the prompt for something complex, one of the most easily identified complexities in literature is irony. So we got those three types of irony.